Erev Tov and welcome everyone. Now, a few months ago, I officiated at a wedding. And as an Orthodox rabbi, one of the important things is to make sure that the ketubah, the marriage contract, which is not actually what makes people married, it's actually a contract to protect the woman should the marriage end. However, for it to be a kosher contract, it needs kosher witnesses. So what defines a kosher witness? Now, without getting into all of the little details, the basic questions that rabbis, most typical Orthodox rabbis, ask for someone to be a kosher witness is if they keep Shabbat and kashrut. Now, that's not everything in Judaism. Generally, there's an assumption that if someone's keeping the laws of Shabbat and kashrut, that they're keeping all of the other stuff. That's definitely not true. And today, when we throw around this word, somebody who's frum, which literally means pious, but the practical, the colloquial way we use it is for a Jew who's very, very observant of Jewish laws. But again, when we think about what does it mean to be observant, often people think about the big ones, what you eat and keeping Shabbos. Now, there's generally a safe assumption that if somebody is keeping the full laws of Shabbat every week, they're probably keeping the laws of the holidays when they pop up. Great. But there is so much more than that. And I remember when I was growing in observance myself, being very self-conscious, which is a very common thing for someone who's growing observance to be self-conscious. They're asking about themselves. So what do? Is they look at what everyone else is doing. And I remember going in an Orthodox shul and I walked by the drinking fountain and I was looking to see if people were making brachas. It was not a good time in my life, but there were little things like that, wondering, these people here, they come to shul, but if it's a weekday, if they're men, do they put on tefillin? And women technically can as well, but do these people pray 3 times a day? Do they say blessings every time they eat, before and after? And the reality is that if one digs in a Jewish law, it's not countless things, not millions of things, but there's a lot of areas of Jewish law that people don't really think about. They kind of focus on the main ones, both in their own personal observance and when they think about what makes an observant Jew. But there's so much more to it than that. Now, some of those laws only come up in certain situations. For example, if somebody's taking a loan from another Jew, there's laws about not taking interest. That's famous. It comes up in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. It doesn't come up every day. So what I want to do with this class, and I'm going to do a few in the future, is focus on certain areas of law that they're real Jewish laws. They come out of the Torah, but we don't think about them. And they can be the mark of somebody who's trying to bring Jewish law and observance and that kind of lifestyle into every area of their life. Because at the end of the day, it's not about judging somebody for how many different laws they keep. It's about trying to live a life in which Judaism permeates every single aspect of it. And if it's only permeating what we eat, and once a week from Friday night to Saturday night, it's not, oh, that's a bad person. It's they're missing an opportunity. And again, as someone had asked a question last week, different levels of observance, et cetera, like that. Is there an expectation that people are keeping all these laws? This class is not now that you learned it, one must start keeping it. It's more of something that people may not be aware of. And if they're generally aware of it, come to a greater understanding of it. And as a rabbi, I love when people say, oh, that's cool. I didn't know it. I want to take on that observance. That's great. But it's not my ultimate goal. My ultimate goal is to educate and for people to be able to make their own informed decisions and see how rich and unique and interesting Jewish law practice is and how it connects us to something greater. So with that big introduction there, let's get into the actual mitzvah, because it's one that, again, a lot of people either don't know about at all or are vaguely aware of, and it really doesn't come up that much, particularly today in the 21st century, as we will see. But the mitzvah is something called Shaatnez, which sounds like a weird word, and we're going to see how weird it is. And it comes up in the context of certain other forbidden activities. So Elizabeth, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and I'll have you take probably the first 2 sources because they're so short. So the first one, this is in the in Vayikra, and there's actually a lot of other mitzvot here about how we treat other people and slaves and murder, just all kinds of laws, just a huge section on laws. And these particular ones in this verse are very ritualistic, and you can see what they have in common. So Elizabeth, please, first verse from Vayikra 19:19.
You shall observe my laws. You shall not let your cattle mate with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed. You shall not put on cloth from a mixture of 2 kinds of material.
Excellent. So we're going to come back to understanding what's going on here. And even though, as I've said in the past, the Torah rarely explains why a mitzvah is given, there's a lot of evidence in the Torah that would kind of point to, as we'll see the rabbis bring out, why this separation of species, as it were. But what these all have in common, the context here, is there's a certain order to nature. There's certain animals that mate with each other, and we do not do that. So for example, I think, what is it? A mule is like a donkey and a horse or something like that. So a Jew cannot make a mule. They cannot have or create a situation in which a donkey and a horse would mate with each other. And there's an interesting question that we're not doing in this class about dog breeds. Are they considered different species, whereby a dachshund and a terrier, one couldn't breed them together? Would that be against the Torah? But the next mitzvah there is not sowing your field. So people would mix seeds together in your field. And yes, when you have these weird fruits and vegetables like avocados or tomato quats and stuff like that, fast forward, you can eat those. Jews are allowed to eat those because they're fine, but a Jew cannot mix different species together. Species are created separate, keep them separate. But the last one we're focusing on tonight is you shall not put on cloth, meaning don't wear. How does the language there? Kilaim Shaatnez lo ya'ale alecha. Don't, literally from the word la'alot, to bring up, don't wear it. So it doesn't actually talk about the making of it. And that's very important. It doesn't talk about making clothes that have a mixture of two species. And by the way, it doesn't define, what does it mean two species? If I make clothes out of a person and a goat, is that for, I can't wear that? Don't do that. So it doesn't define species, but it says if you have clothing made from two different species, the threads of, let's say a sheep and a giraffe, a Jew could not wear that. Now, that's not what the practical law is, but that's the idea being proffered here. So before we get into the why, and then the practical what of it, one of the first questions that a lot of people might ask is, what on earth is that word Shaatnez? Every other word here in the Hebrew is totally identifiable. Well, the word Shaatnez is, I included the phrase here, hapax legamemnon, which is a word that doesn't exist anywhere else, or a word that's it's only used in a particular context one time and its meaning is peculiar. But this word Shaatnez, we have no idea. So Ibn Ezra, Avram Ibn Ezra, 12th century Spain, who's a grammarian and tries to get like the simple, straightforward meaning, contextual meaning of the text, takes a crack at it, and he brings several of the classical explanations. So Elizabeth, you can take source 2 as well.
Of two kinds, the transmitters of tradition said that the word Shaatnez, two kinds, is made up of 3 words. It makes a 5-letter root. The meaning of Shaatnez is mixed. It is a noun which stands alone in scripture.
Excellent. So he mentions first, he doesn't bring it out, that the rabbis say, Shah, Tava, there's basically 3 different words that create Shaatnez, but each of those words has to do with how it's sewn together. It has to do with, practically how one used to make clothes. And that's probably not the meaning of it. It's a rabbinic mnemonic. If somebody says, what is defined as mixing together 2 threads for clothes, does it mean gluing them together? No, it means sewing them together. So the rabbis say, well, the word Shaatnez can be broken into the 3 different types of sewing that are forbidden. So it's more of a mnemonic the rabbis create, but practically speaking, we don't know. And Ibn Ezra says it seems to be mixed. That seems to be the meaning from context, but there's no other word like this anywhere in the Mikra in the Torah. So your guess is as good as mine. People have compared it to words in ancient languages, but nobody has a good guess. It's not like you can go to an academic who says, well, I believe the Torah was written by blah, 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 and archaeology has proven this word is this. The rabbis would be happy to know what the real meaning, etymology of the word is. We haven't the faintest. We know practically what the Torah means when it says Shaatnez, mixing of 2 different kinds of animals in the material of the clothes, but the word is a mystery, which is pretty cool. So before we go on to kind of understanding what the Torah might be doing here and why it's so opposed, why God is so opposed to mixing of species, any questions up until now? And for those who just joined, welcome. Irv, yes, I'm going to unmute you and then leave you unmuted to take on the next source. You just got to click on your side, click unmute on your side. All right, go for it.
So
Irv,
is that word only used when you're referring to material?
as opposed to?
Well, I don't, mixing of foods or mixing of,
No, so when someone says Shaatnez, yes, it only refers to the mixing of different threads of different animals, or really any kind, in clothing. And as we'll see through the rabbis, it gets a very specific definition. I talked about goats and giraffes. That we actually find that that's not included in the traditional understanding of Shaatnez. But no, they're different.
Okay.
If somebody's talking about forbidden foods like mixing of milk and meat, they would use a different ta'arovet. They would use different words to describe other kinds of mixtures. Shaatnez is only by clothes, something that you wear on your body. Excellent. So this next source, Irv, I'll just leave you unmuted here. Just to put things a little bit in context, this rabbi here, the Rabbi Yaakov Asher, his grandfather wrote probably one of the most authoritative commentaries on the Talmud, and his grandson wrote a compilation, probably not the first, but one of the most important compilations of Jewish law. So he wrote it, he called it the Arba Turim, the 4 different sections or rows. And then a generation later, the Rabbi Yosef Cairo took that, wrote a commentary on it, and turned it into the Shulchan Aruch. So this is the father or grandfather of the Shulchan Aruch, and he is famous for that. But he also wrote a commentary on the Torah. And what's great about it is it's kind of a summary and abridgment of the generations before him and all of their opinions. So that rather than having to read everybody else, he's going to tell us what everybody else said about this. So Irv, if you would go ahead and take, you must not mate your animal. Oh, and just one other thing, this first chunk here, the section 3 that you'll read, actually talks about the other 2 mitzvot, about not breeding together different animals, but the idea behind it is connected very strongly with mixing of clothing. The whole philosophy behind why mixing together different animal species seems to be problematic. And again, God didn't tell us why, but the rabbis here have some beautiful guesses at perhaps why. So Irv, please, you must not mate.
you must not mate your animal with another species. Ibn Ezra writes that the Torah links the laws of not interbreeding species and the encouragement to become holy in order to make the point that after you have become a holy nation, you must not commit violent acts against any person sharing your beliefs, and you must not even forcefully interfere with the animal's natural way of behavior, which is, after all, the way they have been programmed to behave by the Creator. Animals are more loyal to their rules, to the rules laid down for his creatures than man is.
So pause there for a moment. So before we get to Rashi's opinion, so Ibn Ezra says that after this section, it talks about, again, the book of Vayikra Leviticus is often called the holiness codes. So this section mentions the idea of being holy, kadosh, unique. And he says here that part of being holy is protecting the world order that God put in place. The rabbis talk about this a great deal. Don't rely on miracles. What's the problem with miracles? Miracles are us begging God to undo the natural order that God already put in place. So by forcing animals to mate with other animals, they may not take it personally. We don't know what goes on in the psychology of animals, but it's seen as forcing animals to go against the nature that they are born with. Now, we are not talking about that in this class, but this conversation does get into or is connected, at least tangentially, to the conversation about homosexuality and the way that the Torah views that, and about, there's a world order. Now, again, or natural things. Now, again, that's very complex because there are people who are naturally attracted to the same gender. So we are not getting into that tonight. I've either done that class or I will do that class. However, understanding that view in this context, whether or not it's insensitive, whether or not it's right or wrong, it makes a lot of sense about looking at the Torah in this way, is that the Torah is concerned with the way the world is set up, maintaining that world order, because that's the way God set it up. So we're going to understand, or that's Ibn Ezra's understanding of why all this separation, because God made apples, apples, potatoes, potatoes, and don't mix them together. And again, mixing them together is not unethical, but it's potentially going against God's order, which we'll see the rabbis unpack that a little bit more, particularly in the next source. So now, Irv, go ahead with Rashi's opinion.
Rashi writes that the prohibition against crossbreeding must be seen as a divine decree. God did not see fit to give us his reasons. Nachmanides writes that the sages did not write anywhere that the underlying reasons for this legislation have been deliberately hidden, given the evil urge and the Gentiles a chance to ridicule and undermine our faith in the Creator. Whereas such an argument is true with respect to the prohibition to mix wool and linen, but not other fibers, the reason for not mixing different seeds in a vineyard or not crossbreeding species of animals are not at all a challenge to our faith. On the one hand, all God's laws, especially those regulating our conduct vis-a-vis him, seeing that they emulate from a higher intelligence, are of a kind whose true intent we are unable to fathom, are beyond our ability to fully comprehend, as opposed to the laws governing interpersonal relations, which we are expected to try and understand. However, we are encouraged in many instances to examine some aspects of how
the chukim, and I'll explain what that word means in a moment.
The chukim are beneficial to our successful existence on this earth. We must not make the observances of these laws conditional on our understanding of their usefulness.
So pause there for a moment, Irv, but before we go on to their appears. So what Rashi introduced is this very important idea. It's actually a category the rabbis use extensively in this bigger form of literature called ta'amei ha-mitzvot, trying to figure out the reasons for mitzvot. And what you just read there is that there's certain mitzvot, interpersonal ones, don't kill, be kind to others, that we can figure out on our own. In fact, later philosophers, both Jewish and non-Jewish, make a distinction. They say with the Torah, all of those ritual laws, we don't need those anymore. As Orthodox, I disagree, but the philosophers say, but the ethical laws of the Torah, that there's clearly a rational, reasonable, reason to have them, which is to build a society. It's the right thing to do. Those we keep. Those are the laws that make sense that we can explain. You can't build a civilization without it. You need to care for others. But there are certain laws that we just can't explain. So we call the laws that are reasonable and rational, those mitzvot, we call them one thing, but the laws that we don't understand, we do them simply because God said, we call those a chok or a statute, something that's just written, and human kings do this too. On Tuesdays, everyone needs to wear the color red. Why? Because the king said so. He has his reasons, and it doesn't matter. Why do you do it? Because the king said to do it. So Rashi proposes that category is we're never going to understand Shaatnez. God has some reason that's beyond human nature to understand. And that kind of gets into Ramban's idea, which is there is a reason for it. God is a perfectly rational, explainable reason for why we can't mix together fibers and then wear that shirt. However, we can't understand it. It's beyond us. Maybe there's some mystical thing. And Ramban, Nachmanides, was a mystic himself. And he said, we might be able to figure it out through meditation and all these different looking into the text, but the average person can't understand it. So why do we do it? Because God said so. And most rabbis, by the way, when they're trying to figure out the mitzvot, they say, regardless of what I said, we should do it anyways. And some rabbis don't like looking for the reasons for mitzvot, because if we say a mitzvah is in place so that we're healthy, then a person will come along and say, oh, well, I can be healthy without doing that mitzvah. That's the famous story of Shmuel, of King Samuel in the Samuel in the Torah, is that the Torah says that a king shouldn't have too many women and too many horses and too much money because it'll lead him to idolatry. So Shlomo, the king, Solomon, not Samuel, sorry, Solomon, King Solomon said, well, I'll have lots of women and horses and money, and I just won't do idolatry. Well, guess what? He tried to go against God's law, and he ended up doing idolatry and building altars. So even though the rabbis talk about different categories of mitzvot, at the end of the day, they all agree, do them because God said so. But they all say there's some mitzvot that either the reason is given, the reason is obvious, but there's some we just can't understand. But now the Torah Aruch says that's true definitely by Shaatnez, but by these other things, maybe there is a reasonable explanation, a perfectly rational reason for these laws of not breeding animals together. So Irv, please continue.
The Creator enabled each species to perpetuate itself by planting its seeds in the appropriate counterpart. Crossbreeding, in the vast majority of cases, would foil the Creator's plan, and such species would die out, as their seed would not produce any issue that was capable of sustaining itself. God provided the seed to those creatures in order to enable his universe to endure as planned. Any activity that puts the creator's intent at risk is therefore forbidden, is an act of insurrection if persisted in. This is the reason why already at the time of reporting creation, the Torah stresses again and again the words,
Lemino and leminehem, to its species or type, and to their, well, he translates it there.
yeah, according to its species or according to their species. He who interferes with this obviously finds fault with the creator, implicitly criticizes him. God does not need his creatures' help in perfecting his universe. He is content if his creatures do not ruin it. We know from experience that even if apparently well-matched human beings mate with one another, especially those forbidden under the rules of incest, any children from such unions are liable to intensified genetic defects which no human being is totally without. In other words, not only do totally different species not reproduce when crossbred, but even members of the same species fail to reproduce satisfactorily if the rules of the Torah are not followed. Who would know best what is good for us if not he who had created us? When the Torah enlarges this prohibition by writing, you must
Sadecha lo
not scatter,
tizra kilaim. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, the English.
you must not scatter more than one type of seed in your field. It includes even relatively simple plants in its regulations. Our sages express their conviction that violating this commandment will be found detrimental to the farmer's interest, even if he thought that he would benefit through such a stratagem. Our sages, Bereshit Rabbah 10:7, have illustrated their approach to the whole subject when they told us that there is not a single species of plant which does not have its own mazel, i.e. protective guardian angel appointed in the heavens. Clearly, such a statement refers only to species created by God, not to new species created by man. Such species are without any heavenly protection.
Excellent, thank you. Now, this conversation here, again, there's so many ways you could take it. We could talk about genetically modified plants and vegetables, which are quite safe, and they allow you to produce bigger ones or more of them, so you can feed more people. They can give more nutrients, et cetera, like that. But then we've also seen examples of people breeding plants that look better or are seedless, and they can't propagate because they don't have seeds. You create a watermelon that's seedless. Oh, that's fun. You don't have to spit out the seeds, but that watermelon dies out after a generation and they have to find some way to keep it alive. And we've done this with potatoes. There's so many different varieties of potatoes, but in America, it's much easier to have just one variety or one kind of potato. But then if there's a potato famine, as happened in Ireland, and there's 50 different kinds of potatoes, a lot of different ones will survive. But if there's one and it gets sick, then it dies out. So we can see in the natural world how sometimes trying to subvert nature doesn't always turn out for the best. Another example of this is the bulldog. The bulldog is this animal with the, if I'm thinking about the right one, is the one where it's like arms are backwards. It's got this horrible, is it underbite and everything like that. And not that they're cute, but people think are adorable. They are suffering. There's so many they have been bred to be just a genetic mess. They're in physical pain, mentally, compared to other dogs. There's just so much wrong there. So there are times when one could argue that using genetic modification or interspecies breeding might be good for the animal, but there are times when we do it for our benefit and we actually really do damage to nature. So again, that would be a whole other conversation about should there be a limit on it? Should it ever be? Because the rabbis do debate, are there appropriate times when not playing God per se, but changing around what's already in the natural world, certainly to cure disease or to help people who are suffering. Many rabbis would agree that's okay. But they all start the conversation with God created, as you read here, Irv, in the beginning of Reshit, it said that when the plants were created, each according to its species. There's a fern plant, there's a this plant. And obviously there's evolution, it's simply a fact, but a lot of evolution happens through natural means. But when we try and go in and mess things up, what happens? Oftentimes we do wipe out species, or we create some animal that's just a horrific nightmare, or we create plants that can't survive after a generation. So we do have to take this, even if it could at sometimes be permitted, we have to ask ourselves that question about, is it our job and is it appropriate for us to be sticking our hands and meddling in the natural world. Whether or not we see God's hand in it, we can do severe damage, and the rabbis recognize that. They take one extreme view, which is God created it perfect, hands off, but there's a lot of truth in what they're saying here. So before we go on, Irv, if you have any questions, just because you're already unmuted, pause for a moment, and then I have someone else has their hand up.
Well, all I was going to say was that currently farmers or agricultural companies have genetically modified corn and wheat. And there are many countries who will not import our grains because they have been modified. And there are times when farmers, if they do not buy these products that are modified, they're eventually forced out of business because of these companies and their policies.
And this is not a platform, but I will say do a little bit of research and like with some accredited sites, you'll find that in most cases, genetically modified fruit and vegetables are totally fine. And when we say genetically modified, we're not saying that we give them the ability to think and walk around. It's just, basically what we've been doing for thousands of years. Farmers have been grafting trees on each other. So we've been doing genetic modification to a simpler for generations. That's one of the reasons we have a lot of varieties. But today we've been losing that. And again, the fear is that we'll do damage. So here it's from a spiritual fear, is how dare we, but he brings in genetic ones. He talks about incest. He talks about people who are related, brothers and sisters, which is true. If they have children, this happened in Egypt a lot. They kept it in the family and in other royal lines, and they had genetic issues and diseases. I mean, even the Jews with Tay-Sachs, we've kept our, fairly insular for generations, and diseases that should have been bred out have been kept inside the family as it were. So pause here for any other questions. Beautiful. Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Now, we saw the tour, Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, talk about these mitzvot about interbreeding of species and seeds, and how, first of all, God created a certain order, and potentially subverting that not only goes against God's God, which is, and they even bring in a religious, almost Kabbalistic idea about every entity on earth has an angel dedicated to it. And the rabbis bring that in the Torah coming up actually in a few parshiot, when Yaakov's wrestling with the angel, and he gets the name of Yisrael, and the angel says, "You have to let me go, it's morning." Why does the angel need to go till morning? The Torah doesn't tell us. It doesn't even say it's an angel. But according to the Midrash, that's the angel that's in charge of a sunrise. And if the angel doesn't go, the sun isn't going to come up. Not to say that God didn't create sunrise and didn't create that angel, but God created certain forces. This is kind of a pre-scientific understanding of how the universe works. Is there is a conscious entity behind all forces in the universe. There's an angel of gravity, etc., like that. But if there's an angel of watermelons with seeds, and then we destroy watermelons with seeds, we're going against, again, the order that God set up. That's A. But B, on a very practical level, if we start messing with the natural order, there may be major consequences. And again, someone who's a scientist might say, sometimes we need to change things around for the sake of science and progress and feeding people. But I think, as we have seen, sometimes we go too far. So now the Torah is specifically going to talk about Shaatnez, wearing a garment with mixed species together. But how could that go against God's order? Because it doesn't talk about making it, it talks about wearing it. So now he's going to make a very interesting shift, and that'll move us into the final part of the class, which is, practically speaking, what does Shaatnez look like today? So Gloria, if you would take source number 4, Uveged Kilaim Shaatnez, and this clothing of mixed together species is Shaatnez. Go ahead.
And a garment consisting of a mixture of lamb's wool fibers and linen fibers, etc. Nachmanides writes that the reason for this prohibition, which singles out wearing a garment made of such a mixture, not the making of the mixture, is that we must learn to keep our distance from species that have been mixed. One of the mystical aspects of the prohibition is that when we in our nether regions don garments made of such forbidden mixtures, we upset even the separation of the species in the heavenly regions. when the sages allowed such mixtures to be part of the priest's garments. This simply means that while engaged in service to God, commanded by him, we do not need to fear the negative emanations that such forbidden mixtures inject into our universe. Halakhic authorities discuss if this prohibition extends to felt containing such mixture of linen and wool fibers, and other details of the finer points of this legislation. Generally speaking, such combinations are considered as forbidden only by rabbinical decree, seeing the materials were not properly interwoven.
Excellent, thank you. So a number of important things happened here. As we saw in the previous source, the two issues that are brought up by the rabbis, one is subverting, going against God's nature and the way that God set up the world. And two is, practically speaking, mixing together species might have unforeseen consequences, whether it be creating, something, unhealthy or damaged in some way, or creating something that can no longer exist anymore, can't propagate. And that's, again, violating God's nature, but also violating that species that we might be wiping out of existence. Even with mosquitoes, where scientists are often saying there's no reason for them to exist, or none that we're aware of, they're trying to breed a kind of mosquito that cannot have a next generation. And then they're going to send it out amongst mosquitoes. It'll spread that gene and they'll die off in a generation. If we're talking about playing God right there, I mean, that's genocidal. But people see that as, oh, well, the benefits outweigh the good. So again, that's not the conversation here, but all of those things have either a scientific or strong, reasonable spiritual explanation. But Shaatnez, which clearly is connected to these things, doesn't make sense in and of itself, because it's not even about mixing them. And again, taking the wool from a sheep or the hair from a goat, which is, we're going to talk about, is not what Shaatnez is practically, and shearing it off and then making a sweater, that's not damaging. And it'd be really hard to argue that that's subverting God's nature, because God didn't create sweaters growing from trees. God gave people the wisdom to be able to make clothes. So how is Shaatnez going against insulting God in any way? And certainly it's not creating any kind of an abominable monster. So what the Torah Aruch brings here from Nachmanides is the idea that it's not the Shaatnez, it's not the sweater or the clothing itself, it's what it reminds us of. And by actively not wearing clothes that have forbidden mixtures in them, it's a way of reminding us that we should not create any kind of forbidden mixture of anything in the world. If we start, and again, psychologically, is there a lot of truth to this? There's a lot of symbolic things in the Torah. And we go back to Rashi and said we can't understand it. And Ramban says the reason, there's no real strong reason for it other than it symbolizes, it's a way of reminding us about these other mitzvot that do make sense. Again, the mitzvah itself, there's not anything that we can understand, but it becomes a symbol for the other mitzvot surrounding it that do make a lot of sense. So we don't wear Shaatnez clothing, we don't wear this forbidden mixed clothing, so that it just creates this, consciousness of we don't mix things in our lives. But then he points out a big seeming contradiction, which is that the Kohanim, the priests, do wear these forbidden mixtures of wool and linen. We'll get to that in a moment, why I said only wool and linen, but these forbidden mixtures when they're serving in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple. And his explanation is, well, if the reason you don't wear Shaatnez is because you want to be fully conscious of God's world and God's nature and not going against it, when are you more conscious of God than when you're serving God in the temple? If people are walking around and going to stores and wearing, goat giraffe shirts, then they'll think goats and giraffes are meant to go together, so I'll breed my goats and giraffes. But in the Beit HaMikdash, no one's thinking about the clothes they're wearing. All they're thinking about is serving God. Now, that doesn't mean this is the answer and what God meant by this mitzvah, but it's one, I think, very reasonable attempt at understanding why Shaatnez is in there, why it's connected in the middle of those other two mitzvot, and perhaps why it is permitted in the context of the temple. Another explanation is that all of these things that are forbidden, like making fire on Shabbat, it is permitted in the temple on Shabbat. Basically, all of these things that for whatever reason they're forbidden, if they're in the service of God, it's fine. So it's not that they're inherently bad, or maybe they are inherently bad, but if you're using them to worship God, their badness goes away. So whatever's wrong with Shaatnez, if you're using it to serve God, it is fine. The last thing he says here, which will lead us into the final section, is that the rabbis can't just say never, they can't just leave a mitzvah out there undefined. Can't just say don't wear forbidden clothes or mixed clothes. What does it mean mixed? So if I make a shirt out of, it's hard to make a shirt out of one thing. Usually need something else in there, whether it's to make it thicker, stronger, or a glue or a dye. So I can only wear a shirt made out of 100% wool, nothing, I can't put buttons on it. Can I put buttons so I can make a button-up shirt, whatever it is? So the rabbis had to define what does it mean to have a Shaatnez piece of clothing. And he already hints here that one of the things that makes Shaatnez is the way it's attached. And felt, that's just, oh, hi, little one. Felt, that's just kind of, pressed together or however it's made. I don't know a lot about creating clothing. That's not really attached the way that something that's, knitted or really made together is attached. So it has to be really attached to be forbidden by the Torah. Now the rabbis, wanting to make sure that we don't see a felt shirt that Shaatnez and think, oh, well, that's fine, and then end up making a fully forbidden shirt. They say any kind of attachment is forbidden, but the Torah is really talking about, knitted together, sewn together, whatever it is like that. And does it mean any mixture whatsoever? So if I make a shirt out of giraffe and nylon, is that forbidden? If I make a shirt out of hair and plastic, is that forbidden? And the answer is no. There are only two materials in this universe that our tradition holds are forbidden. Any other mixture, like if you all don't take your clothes off, but if any of you are taking your clothes off later and look at thank you for that, look at your tags later, and you'll often see that there might be 5, 6, 7 different kinds of ingredients or materials in there. So does that mean we can't wear our clothes? And the rabbis explicitly say that if somebody is walking in the public market on market day and they are wearing Shaatnez, not that they have to take it off, you take it off of them, even if they'll be embarrassed because they'll be naked in public. So I'm definitely not suggesting that right now in this class, but obviously some mixtures are fine, mostly polyester, et cetera, like that. But our last source is going to delineate and clarify for us what materials are forbidden. And the question about why specifically these two is a little beyond the scope of this class, but there are different verses elsewhere in the Torah that kind of hint at that these two species are just so fundamentally different, they can't be mixed together. And then this final source, we're also talking about practically, when does this even apply today? The class was said, are there forbidden clothes in your closet? It's entirely possible, but highly unlikely. So before we go on to the last source, any questions up until now?
Oh, quick question, Rabbi. This is Menachem.
Yeah, go ahead, Menachem. Oh, wonderful to have you. Yeah, please go ahead.
Just wondering, so in terms of the kind of the issue itself, right, the prohibition itself, are there any limitations, for example, right, so say you have a baguette or you have a clothing, right, which has only like a fraction of the percent of tzemer and rest of it is linen. Is that forbidden too?
So Menachem's question is this: let's say you do have clothing that has Shaatnez in it, that has this forbidden mixture, but it's only a tiny amount, like it's the one holding on a button or something like that. So it is a question that the rabbis, I don't know if he's going to talk about it here, but typically, yes, even when it's a small amount, it is problematic. There's this law called bitul, nullification, that can apply in certain cases when something is very minor, but it often does not apply here, especially because it's a Torah level prohibition, and it's also not accidental. There is a question, if somebody made clothes and they intentionally made, even with a small amount, this forbidden mixture, it's intentional. So you can never undo intentional. But let's say that you have a garment and the amount is so small that, and they just didn't even put it in because it was secondary, it was a scrap that fell on the floor or something like that, it was unintentional, then there's more room to be lenient if they don't even list it in the ingredients. But generally, no, when people check for Shaatnez, which we'll talk about these Shaatnez labs, and we do have one in Milwaukee, I'll mention it at the end, no, they'll look for even the minutest amounts. So great question. So this last section here, we've seen Rabbi Melamed before, we saw him in our class on pluralism, and he writes both published books, Peninei Halakha, on all areas of Jewish law. He also writes for an Israeli newspaper these articles on different topics of Jewish thought and Jewish law. So he wrote this lovely article that goes through Shaatnez, and he does the mitzvah, which is great because it'll kind of summarize and clarify what the mitzvah is. And he also talks about practically when does this come up? When do you have to be concerned for it? He even goes into kind of the history of clothes making. I took making clothes. I took some of that out, but this is a great article, originally in Hebrew, translated on his website. And what I'll do is, rather, Leonard, than have you read the whole next 2 pages, I'll have you take the first section and then we'll switch off. So the first thing you do, which is excellent, which he does is excellent, is he just kind of summarizes what is the mitzvah? What is the thing that is forbidden from the Torah? And again, this is not a mitzvah where you actively have to go out and do something like give charity or shake a lulav on Sukkot. This is something that we should refrain from doing. So the issue only comes up when you're buying a new suit or a new dress, etc. So Leonard, go ahead. The Torah commanded.
The Torah commanded not to wear a garment made of tzemer, wool, and pishtan, linen, as it is written, keep my decrees, do not wear a garment that contains Shaatnez, a forbidden mixture of wool and linen fabrics. Wool is what grows on the species called keves, sheep, whose males are called elim, rams, and females rechalim, lambs. However, what grows on other animals is not included in the prohibition because it is not just called wool, but carries a byname such as camel wool or rabbit wool. In the past, the most common clothing was made from wool or linen, so much so some sages held the opinion that when the Torah says beged, garment, without elaborating its intention, is that of a garment made of wool or linen.
So pause there for a moment. So the rabbis looked at the Torah and it talked about a beged, clothes, and that being the issue of Shaatnez. And this is, so right here, he did a great job of kind of explaining the history of how did we get from just any forbidden mixture to specifically only wool or linen. And what he explains is that when the Torah uses foundational language, and this is a very interesting thing, why we chose it this way. Sometimes when the Torah talks about a specific word that could mean many different things, the rabbis say it's expansive, meaning if it says animals, it means all animals. But sometimes when it says animals, it means only kosher animals or animals that you farm with. So the question is, when are you expansive? When do you limit? And anyone who comes to shul early enough, there's a section called Rabbi Yishmael, which is a rabbinic pre-Talmudic source, a baraita, and he says, here are the laws that you use to understand mitzvot in the Torah. When do you say it, a very big category, and when do you say a limited category? So in this case, the rabbi said it's an extremely limited category. We are going to say clothing. When we say clothing, what do we mean? Well, clothes are either made from wool or linen. Well, what does wool mean? Wool always means lamb wool. Why? Because they understand that if you make wool out of rabbits, you say it's rabbit wool or giraffe wool. But when you say wool and you mean clothes, you only mean lambs. And when you say linen, etc. So the rabbis say that the Torah here had a very specific, and again, did they do that simply because people weren't using other materials for clothes? That could be a very good explanation. Or because they were concerned that people would get confused about what materials may or not be okay. But regardless, the rabbi said that when we say wool, the Torah means one thing. When we say linen, the Torah means one thing. And that's where we get the idea that it is only wool and flax, which is a kind of plant linen. Those are the only two things which are forbidden by the Torah because they were the main ingredients in clothes of ancient times. So you could wear a flax linen shirt. You could wear a wool shirt. I have a wool sweater I got in Scotland many years ago, 100% wool. Those are fine. But to mix those things together, then one is breaking the Torah if they wear it. Someone could actually, I believe a Jew could make a Shaatnez shirt. I don't think it's a good idea, but they could not wear it. So Leonard, go ahead, the prohibition.
The prohibition is to wear a garment that has wool and linen together, such as a woolen garment sewn with linen thread, or even only if its label is made of linen. However, there is no prohibition to wear two different pieces of clothing at once.
So I could wear my wool sweater with a linen scarf which you could have something. It'd probably be more likely the other way around, a linen shirt with a wool scarf. That's fine. But it's only if it's mixed together in the actual garment itself. Please continue, Leonard.
However, there is no prohibition to wear two different pieces of clothing at once, one made of wool and the other linen. Thus, one is permitted to wear wool trousers and a linen shirt. It is also permissible to wear a woolen robe and fasten it with a linen belt. For as long as there is no bond of sewing or a permanent joining between the woolen garment and the linen one, there is no prohibition. A combination of other threads made from various plants, such as hemp and cotton, is permitted from Divrei
Chachamim.
Rabbinic ordinance. It is also forbidden to sit on cloth that contains Shaatnez, lest a loose thread touch one's bare body, even slightly, or lest one mistakenly wraps himself with it.
So pause there for a moment. So Shaatnez, this forbidden thing, which again we said is only wool and only linen mixed together and like really mixed together into one garment, it's forbidden to wear it. But if I am wearing a full body suit, like a scuba suit that covers every inch of me, and I lay down on a blanket made of that is Shaatnez, made of wool and linen, technically it's certainly not forbidden by the Torah, but the rabbis say don't do that. Why? Because let's say I take off my scuba suit and that blanket gets wrapped around me, and then it basically becomes like I'm wearing that blanket, which is forbidden. So again, we see here, this kind of goes back to, we kind of claim that the Torah created Shaatnez in order to be a fence around the other mitzvot. By not wearing Shaatnez, it prevents us from doing these other mitzvot of breeding species together, which is much more damaging and violating of the natural order of things. And the rabbis too create this fence around the Torah. They create certain laws and practices that prevent us from ever breaking a Torah law. That's, again, a class in and of itself. But if you go to someone's house and they have wool throws all over, the first thing you do is you go look at the tags there and see if there's any linen in there, which again, you're unlikely to, but we'll get to that. So Leonard, just a little bit more, really just basically a sentence, in order to prevent
such mistakes, our sages additionally decree the prohibition of sitting or lying down on a couch cover containing Shaatnez, even if there were 10 kosher fabrics upon it.
So this reminds me of this great story in the Talmud. I don't even remember the context, but somebody is wearing like 10 layers of sweaters. Anyone seen the show Friends? There's a famous scene where a character's wearing like 30 pairs of clothes. So they're this giant bulky thing. But if the bottom 29 layers are all kosher, but the top one is Shaatnez, Gloria and Leonard, based on what you've seen here of the rabbis, do you think they would permit that?
Probably not.
No, and I see Irv shaking his head as well, and others as well, as no, the rabbis. Now, would the Torah forbid that? Perhaps, because even though it's not touching one's skin, they're definitely wearing it, even in an absurd, funny way. But the rabbis were, again, very concerned that we would even come close to breaking a Torah prohibition, which, as we saw, might be a thing that's put in place to help us from breaking another prohibition in the Torah itself. So this next little section here, actually, I'll pause here because this was it was a great summary, added some really important nuance as to the extent of Shaatnez, even a small amount is a problem, even if it's the label, and why specifically only wool and linen, because those were fundamental ingredients of clothes. And you can see literally the way we use language, just the fact that people, when they say, it's like Kleenex. Kleenex is a brand that makes tissues. But people sometimes say, pass me a tissue. They sometimes say, pass me Kleenex. But whenever somebody says, Kleenex, they only mean one thing. And a lot of people, when they think of tissues, even though there are other companies that make it, they only think of Kleenex. So our language, regardless of whether it's real, there are other kinds of wools in the world. But when people think of wool, personally, I only think of lamb's wool. And linen, I don't think I've ever owned any clothing made of linen, so it doesn't come up for me. And it's not a common thing so much anymore anyways. So any questions on this first section before we go on? Beautiful. So Ken, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. This next section here, as I said, he wrote something much bigger. I kind of abridged it, and it's just getting into the kind of practical, like, is this really much of an issue anymore? And he basically explains not as much as it used to be. So this is more of a little history lesson, which is cool. So Ken, go ahead. The upsurge of cotton.
Yeah, but by the way, linen shirts and linen suits are common, I think, still now in the summertime because they really breathe well. So,
and by the way, a linen suit is fine as long as there's no wool in it, which again, it's rare to begin with. And in the times of the Torah, I don't know how common it was. That's something that perhaps somebody could easily look up to see if it used to be common to have wool and linen mixed together. But as he's about to point out here, even if it was common, it doesn't need to be anymore. Why? Because we got plenty of other stuff to work with. Go ahead, Ken.
Sure. The upsurge of cotton, the amount of cotton produced in the world today is 25 times that of wool. Additionally, there are other threads produced from types of plants and animals, which also contribute to a certain reduction in the percentage of wool and linen used in the clothing industry. Still, when manufacturers wanted to sew woolen fabrics with strong thread, they would sew it with strong linen threads. Therefore, wool suits and coats had to be checked for Shaatnez, as well as for sofas and armchairs covered with woolen fabrics. In practice, the rate of clothes made from wool and linen in the entire clothing industry declined to just 1%, and the share is likely to continue to decline.
So apparently linen was a very good material to attach wool together, which for non-Jews doesn't matter, but for Jews is quite problematic. And he also talks here about the rise of, but again, if somebody thinks of a shirt made of cotton, which is insanely popular today, we're probably, almost all of us are very likely wearing either all cotton clothes or at least some things made of cotton, but nobody would call cotton wool. And cotton didn't even exist in the time of the Torah. So there's a side question. This comes up with Pesach, with this forbidden category of kitniot, is, forbidden legumes and things like that. What if there are new species we discover or breed or create that look like kitniot? Should we also forbid those? So some rabbis have talked about peanuts and said peanuts were not there when the rabbis made their original practice, their original custom. So peanuts should not join it. So too, even though cotton today, when you talk about clothes, you really think about cotton. So if the Torah says clothing with forbidden, etc., but cotton wasn't there at the time. And the rabbis, no rabbi has suggested that cotton should become the new wool, the new definition of clothing, and therefore forbidden. So it didn't make the cut, which is a good thing. Shelley, I saw you had your hand up. Where did you go? Okay, Shelley just clicked to unmute. You just got to unmute on your side and then go ahead.
Well, that was actually my question, because now that linen is really not a commonplace thing, and if we're sort of assuming that that was the reason in the first place, why wouldn't the rabbis, just maybe because rabbis will never all get together to agree on something? There's, I don't know. Why wouldn't they change the rule to be cotton and wool?
Yeah. So, again, if we go back to that reason, and this is one of the things is, even though it's fun and important for us to try and figure out the reasons behind mitzvot, unless God tells us, we don't know. So if we say the original reason for it, God made Shaatnez because of X, Y, and Z, we should not change the law because of it. So in terms of like, we think we understand the law better than God, so let's adjust to cotton. We'd never do that because that would imply that we actually got the reason. By saying we know the reason, it just add meaning to it to help us connect to it and understand why we would continue to do it. But in terms of, okay, fine, but the rabbis clearly said that forbidden mixtures of clothing is defined by what is clothing and what is, wool, and its wool is only sheep, etc. As I said, not about reason for the mitzvah, but how we define clothes. So cotton is clothing now. It might be similar to that kitniot thing, which is that we don't want to become stricter. We don't want to expand the law any more than it already has. We have an existing tradition. And there's really, theoretically, hypothetically, could we do that? Maybe. Is there any kind of feeling that we need to do it? Also, the rabbis, when they read the Torah, and the Torah was given, even though the Torah is timeless, it was given at a specific time. And the clothing that they had then was wool and linen. So the rabbis might say that when God gave the mitzvah, he gave it to a world that was defined by wool and linen clothing. So clearly it was intended for then and not for today, because if it meant cotton, then that mitzvah didn't even apply back then. So again, because the rabbis have interpreted it and the Torah left it very vague, your question is valid. Hypothetically, the rabbis could redefine clothing and expand Shaatnez. I don't think anybody wants to. I think there's such a strong tradition based on the Talmud, which is extremely authoritative, that nobody would want to go against that. And the historical explanation that, look, the Torah was given to a world of wool and linen. It was meant for wool and linen. That's how the rabbis understood it. We're going to end that conversation there. And it still does come up, rare as it is. It still applies today in rare cases, but we're not going to play with this. And the other thing is, once you open that Pandora's box, there are a lot of mitzvot that we'll be changing left and right, which there's an argument that in some cases we should. But this is not an area where anybody's clamoring, hey, let's expand Shaatnez, because it'll just be, and that could be the other thing, is the rabbis, by limiting it to wool and linen, maybe there was some impact financially, but there's always been other alternatives. And now it's not an issue. If the rabbis expand it, the rabbis say the Torah would never give us a law that we could not keep.
Excuse me.
Bless you. Doesn't mean the Torah doesn't give us challenging mitzvot, but would never give us something that the people are just going to reject. And if you say today that polyester and cotton are a forbidden mixture, nobody's going to embrace that mitzvah. Absolutely. It will be rejected left and right. And Jewish law is as much what the rabbis and the Torah wrote as what the people decided to actually accept upon themselves. But in terms of your line of thinking, that is a valid way of approaching it. But I think for many reasons, no one would ever institute that. So good luck with that, Shelley.
So
But
one
it's a very good
quick
Yeah,
question.
please.
When you were talking about the giraffe wool or the giraffe cloth, the goat or whatever, when you were discussing that, so that, and you said, well, people would look at that and it would remind them, but when they're checking for Shaatnez, they're like, going in the label, they're going in the lapel of the jacket or whatever. I mean, people can't tell when you're looking at it. So I guess that part doesn't really hold anymore.
Yeah, well, so that's an interesting thing about the challenge. The issue with Ta'amei mitzvot is explaining something is it might have made sense to explain a mitzvah at one time and not anymore. So that's why, unless God gave us a reason for something, this is all just speculation, which is fun and interesting. And we enjoy doing it. It might add more meaning to the mitzvot, but we shouldn't hang our hats on it, as it were, and say that's the final thing for it. So his explanation might have been true at one point, but there's also a lot of mitzvot we do that kind of are meant to be symbols and remind us of stuff. They don't do it 24/7. If I'm buying a new suit and I know that it has Shaatnez in it, I'll stop and say, oh, the mitzvah and everything like that. Obviously, if I just had one that had Shaatnez and I wasn't aware of it, it wouldn't do anything. I would just be passively, committing an averah, committing a sin. But this is the fun, but also the danger of, reasons for the mitzvot. Excellent. So I want to go ahead and polish things up here. And, Ken, why don't you go ahead and take the practical halakha, please?
Okay. The practical halakha. In the vast majority of clothing today, there is no concern of Shaatnez because they are made of synthetic or cotton material. Therefore, whenever it is written on the label of a garment that it is mainly made of synthetic cotton or other non-woolen or linen materials, one should not be concerned that they contain Shaatnez. Although in rare cases, garments may have a wool or linen embroidery or were sewed with linen thread, nevertheless, there will still be no mixture of wool and linen together. Only in very rare cases can one find both a linen thread and a wool decoration attached to a garment. However, since it is a very distant concern of less than 1/1000th of a percent, it is enough to read the label on the garment. And if it is not written that it is made of wool or linen, one should not be concerned it contains Shaatnez. In woolen or linen clothes too, it is enough for the buyer to look at the clothing label. If it is written that the garment is made of wool or linen or other material without a blend of wool and linen, it does not need to be checked. True, sometimes labels are inaccurate, or because a wool or linen garment made of less than 1% or 2% does not need to be listed, or because in rare occasions a garment can be mislabeled. However, in practice, as long as it is not written on the label that there is both wool and linen in the garment, the likelihood that it contains Shaatnez is a fraction of a percent, much less than a minute, whatever it
Mute
is,
hamitsui, the tiniest of the tiniest amount.
10% is not tiny.
Less than 10%, less than 10%.
Therefore, one not be concerned about it.
When I was living in Manhattan, but as I was in rabbinical school, before I had actually learned this stuff, I think Sarah had gotten some sweater or dress or something that had, I think, wool in it. And right next to my yeshiva, literally the building next door, was a Shaatnez lab. You know, when you think of lab, you think of, you know, like all of the beakers and everything like that. No, that's just a fancy name for it. It's someone who has a really nice microscope or one of those eyeglass piece things where they can look closely at the material and they know what they're doing. So I called ahead. And the person said, come over. I went over. It was the rabbi's wife, actually. And even though, you know, she wasn't formally in charge of the lab, she clearly knew it as well as her husband. And I told her, I showed her the garment, told her what our concern was. And she said, because it doesn't list it here, you don't need to worry about it. It's only if it actually says wool and linen, or if it doesn't say at all. You had it custom made in another country and there's a chance of it, then you'd bring it in. But she said the label doesn't list it doesn't list linen, you're totally fine. And that's the practice today. So Menachem's question about, you know, does a small amount matter? Because it's so rare, and by the way, when it says it doesn't need to be listed, it's not a Jewish thing. If a company makes clothes and they have whatever it is, 0.1% or whatever the number is of linen or of any material, you know, cockroach ears or something like that, they don't need to, that happens with peanut butter all the time. They don't need to list it if it's super, 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 super tiny. But does that mean that bittul works, that you can, if we know there was linen put in there? No, we can just assume that if it doesn't list it, it's fine. So if you buy clothes and it says 100% wool or 90% wool, 10% polyester, you are fine. So realistically, again, this doesn't come up for the most part because most things have labels, and usually wool and linen are not mixed together. Although I was able to just briefly look to the side, Menachem, to your question, even if linen is mixed in, even if it's 0.02%, but it's one of the ingredients, you took linen threads and mixed it with wool threads, it is still forbidden. However, if you took flax, which is what you make linen from, when it's still in its plant-like, you know, whatever, it's still like plant material, and you take cotton when it's still in its cotton form, and you mix them together while they're still in their raw form, and then make a new thread for it, as long as the flax material is very, very small, you know, 10% or 25%, you know, a minority by a lot, then it's fine. That is the only case in which linen could be consciously mixed in with wool. If in its raw form, as long as it's a super minority, it's mixed together with a permitted material to make a thread, then it would be fine to mix with wool. And then this last section here, we don't even need to read it, which is that the only time this really comes up today is in very, very expensive fancy wool suits. Sometimes you have a little bit of linen. So unless the tag is explicit, it's usually a good chance to get them, or he says there's somewhat of a concern that wool was placed in its collar, it's appropriate to check it if you have a linen suit or a wool suit. But in most cases, you can go by the label. And even though we can go by the label, it rarely ever comes up anymore. But if someone is trying to integrate their Judaism into every area of their life, even something like Shaatnez, which rarely comes up, it's still part of a rich Jewish life. And even just to learn about it, just the fact that you've all learned about it, even if this never comes up for any of you, this can enrich what does it mean to be Jewish, that you are aware of Shaatnez, that maybe you'll go in your closet and you can say, you know what, I inherited a suit, or I inherited a dress, or I have a wool hat, and I just want to look at my tag. That's a unique, beautiful, rich Jewish moment.